And welcome once again to Flashpoints on Washington Unplugged. I'm Bob Orr, along with, as always, Juan Zarate, our national security analyst. Juan, good to see you.
Bob, great to see you.
Let's start with Libya, because it's a very confusing picture coming out of there. If you read one account, it looks like the rebels are making real progress on the verge of maybe expelling Gaddafi, and then you look at other accounts and it's different. What's going on?
Well, I think you have to be careful not to make conclusions based on the day-to-day reporting from what's coming from Libya. Right now, it looks like the rebels are making a very strong push to surround Tripoli, especially moving from the mountains in the west, perhaps even cutting off key supply lines for Gaddafi from Tripoli to Tunisia. And we've seen some what appear to be acts of desperation by Gaddafi with the firing of the first Scud missile landing apparently harmlessly out to the east in the desert. But it appears the rebels are making progress, heading closer and closer to the center of Tripoli, which has always been the goal. The goal is to take over Tripoli, to attack it, and to topple Gaddafi. The challenge, though, here is you've seen over the last couple of weeks a rebel movement and a government, the Transitional National Council, which is the rebel government in Benghazi, appear to be in a bit of disarray. You had the killing of General Yunus, the longtime Gaddafi confidant who had been leading the rebel forces, apparently killed by Islamist factions and militias within the movement, and then a dissolution of the cabinet within the Transitional National Council. So it appeared they were in disarray, having to deal with a lot of conflict, having to deal with some intra-tribal factionalism. But it appears again today that the news is much better for the rebels. They're moving closer to Tripoli and may have their ducks in a row here.
Now, clearly it hasn't reached the tipping point yet, but Gaddafi looks pretty wobbly. This idea of launching a Scud, which missed, I think, by 50 kilometers, isn't that an act of desperation? And what about all these rumors of more defections from his inner circle?
I think that's right. I think, the days are numbered for Gaddafi. The question is, how many days do you have here? I mean, he really can't survive long-term in Tripoli. I think the challenge, though, for the United States, NATO, and the rebels is how long will it take? What further pressure does this entail? You've got the NATO mandate ending in September here, and so you've got a really critical moment for the international community as to what they're going to do, how they're going to further pressure Gaddafi. But overall, the trend is not good for Gaddafi. I mean, he's bunkered into Tripoli. He still has the support of his own tribe, the Qaddafi, and the Magraha tribes and some other factions. But it's fairly weak, and he's seen some defections, and the rebels seem to be gaining some momentum. But again, in Libya, you got to be careful here not to read too much into the day-to-day news, because the rebels could advance today and see a retreat tomorrow. So we've got to be careful with our long-term judgments.
Well, it's certainly true this has gone on longer than many in the administration were hoping. I mean, they wanted this to be over.
I think that's right. I think the assumption was once NATO air power came in, the no-fly zone was put in place, that Gaddafi would be toppled fairly quickly. It hasn't happened.
Okay, moving to Pakistan, just when you thought relations couldn't get any more tense between Pakistan and the U.S., now comes a report that maybe the Pakistani intelligence services showed our stealth helicopter to the Chinese. What's going on there?
Well, we are really reaching a low point in terms of the relationship between the United States and Pakistan, a level of distrust that I think we haven't seen since the late 1990s, when you had a real break in the relationship between the U.S. and Pakistan. This is the latest evidence of that. If the report is true, that Pakistan did indeed allow Chinese officials to not only take pictures of the remnants of the stealth helicopter, the tail portion that we've all seen there up against the wall in the compound in Abbottabad, but also to take skin samples, to go back to test and perhaps replicate or reverse engineer. That's really an affront to the relationship and a sign of deep distrust. The U.S. made very clear to Pakistan that we did not want anybody, in particular the Chinese, to see that technology. And if in fact they did, either out of anger or as a matter of strategic positioning, that's a major problem, because Pakistan understands the challenge that China represents to the United States in the long term, and what a devastating sort of revelation that would be in the context of the relations.
So this is, at least it appears, a stick in the eye, but is it more damaging than that, perhaps?
I think it is. I think it's not only a stick in the eye, but it's a strategic stick in the eye. That is to say, Pakistan can always hold over the head of the United States its relationship with China. It's the most important trading partner, about $9 billion a year in trading, most important arms supplier, China, to Pakistan. A lot of deep investments in, for example, deep water ports and infrastructure in Pakistan coming out of China. And so Pakistan always holds the relationship with China over the heads of the United States. in some ways as a threat to say, look, if our relations are not good, if aid isn't flowing, if we're not simpatico, we can always turn to the Chinese. And they understand that that's not beneficial to the United States, and that represents not just a bilateral issue, but a real geopolitical issue of concern for us. This, I think, is going to be a real point, again, of awakening for the U.S. We've already cut off some aid, $800 million in aid. The Pakistanis have cut off visas for U.S. officials. We've pulled out some of the trainers from the special ops community. I'm just not hopeful that we're going to see any improvement in the relationship anytime soon, and incidents like this are only going to make it worse.
Of course, the big stakes don't change. We're still worried about stability in the area, still worried about Al-Qaeda, worried about how India responds. So this is not just a chess game. There are real consequences.
No, this is right. You can't throw the baby out with the bathwater here. I mean, you really have to pay attention to the relationship with Pakistan, regardless of how angry we may be, especially with an incident like this. And we've got to watch not only the internal dynamics, the nuclear dynamics, relationships with India, and all of the instability that could erupt out of South Asia.
If we had a Hall of Fame list for flashpoints, on the list would be North Korea, because there's always trouble.
It's always something.
Always trouble brewing there. What's going on there? Any signs of optimism?
Well, interestingly, I think under the radar screen, this has been a bit of a summer of rapprochement with North Korea. You've had the beginnings of discussions. The first discussion between the nuclear negotiators between North Korea and South Korea since 2008 happened just a couple of weeks ago. You've had a North Korean official, a very high-level foreign ministry official, come to the United States and meet with the U.S. envoy Stephen Bosworth, who's charged with these issues, meeting here in the U.S., all in the hopes of bringing North Korea back to the six-party talks, which has always been the desire of this administration and of the other partners in those talks, to get them to the table to commit to talking about their nuclear program. Instead, the last couple of years have been filled with a lot of bellicosity from North Korea, a lot of real world war fighting. I mean, they've launched attacks. They sunk the Cheonan, the South Korean naval vessel. And so there's been a lot of tension over the last 2 years. But interestingly, this summer has brought some talks and some hope that the North Koreans actually might come to the table. This is also matched, by the way, Bob, by the North Koreans engaging more aggressively with the Chinese and maybe even now the Russians on some trade deals. The Chinese are interested in some mining operations and have developed that over the past couple of years. China, of course, wants stability in North Korea and the Korean Peninsula. So this is all going to be very interesting to watch, but there may be a ray of hope here, at least in terms of the talks.
I don't think we should get too confident, though. I mean, with the regime in place, it's not going anywhere. He's proven to be a little crazy in the past.
No, absolutely right. And I think there are two things to keep in mind. One is that North Korea returns to the same playbook over and over again. Take the world to the brink, act in a Brinksman-like fashion, and get concessions in return, economic, diplomatic, or whatever. Secondly, they're worried about succession. They're worried about internal stability, and that's going to drive a lot of what they do. Whether it's their bellicosity or their negotiations, they're going to be primarily focused on the stability of their regime, the survivability of the family, and whether or not they can keep that country together.
Last stop today really is more about a policy than a place. This is about the administration's new transnational organized crime initiative. What is that? What is it about? I
think this is really important. Not much reported in the news because of everything else going on in the world, but the administration launched a transnational organized crime strategy, really the first in over a decade, and I commend the administration for this. What they did was they had launched an intelligence review to look at the threat coming from international organized crime groups. And the conclusion of that intelligence review was that you have a problem that is much more global in scope, much more fluid, and much more dangerous in the ability of these groups to wield economic, political, and other influence to include in strategic markets in terms of affecting then national security. And so this strategy then is intended to go after transnational organized crime groups in a different way, in a way that's appropriate for the 21st century.
Give me an example of who these groups are. I mean, where are they from? What are they about?
All right. One interesting thing the administration did was to sign a new executive order, which basically gives the Secretary of the Treasury the power to freeze assets of networks and companies and entities controlled by these organized crime groups. They named 4 groups. One, the Yakuza, a group of 80,000 or so Japanese organized crime figures who are incredibly powerful. Laura Logan did a great piece about the Yakuza on 60 Minutes a couple of years ago. So that's one of the groups. Los Zetas, the very violent and now economically pretty powerful Mexican drug cartel made up of ex-Mexican special forces, many of whom now have ownership interests in the United States and elsewhere. And so the idea here is go after their financial infrastructure. The Brother Circle, a group of Russian organized crime figures out of the old Soviet bloc who not only are vicious, but also have deep ties into the economies of Asia and Europe and have wielded quite a bit of influence. And the last one that I'm not all that familiar with, but it's interesting, is the Camorra, which is part of the Italian organized crime constellation, based out of Naples, about 8,000 strong, and according to U.S. officials, has really grown in sophistication and fluidity, building up its investments globally. So what you have really is a focus on these groups that have been able to not only use criminal activity, drug trafficking, human smuggling, counterfeiting, money laundering, but also their ability to filter into the legitimate financial world and commercial world to then exert influence. And I think the United States, like other countries like the UK, are starting to focus more heavily on this, and I think that's all to the good.
A little bit out of the counterterrorism playbook, attack the financing, that kind of gets at the root of the organization.
Yes, near and dear to my heart. It's the same paradigm we applied to terrorist financing that was then applied to counterproliferation, that was then applied in other contexts, had been applied in drug trafficking in the past. Now it's being applied to transnational organized crime.
And just quickly, Juan, how do we know if it's effective? What signs do we look for to say that this policy is making some kind of difference?
Well, I think there's probably two key things to look at. One, do we see signs that the influence of these groups where they are most physically present actually diminishes? A huge problem, for example, the Brother Circle is, and other Russian organized crime groups, is they have enormous influence over governance in places like Ukraine and Russia. So do we start to see signs that their influence actually starts to wane, that there's more prosecutions against them, that they're being held to account in ways that doesn't make them untouchable? So that's one thing. The second is, do you start to see the legitimate financial and commercial world start to be more careful, the way that they have been on counterproliferation and terrorism, about doing business with nefarious actors or fronts for these organizations? And so do banks, for example, start closing bank accounts? Do they start freezing assets on their own? Do we start seeing a property appropriated by governments that's then controlled by these organized crime groups? I think that will then start to be a signal that the world's taking this very seriously. Problem's not going to go away tomorrow, but the fact that we're focusing on it, I think, is important in the 21st century.
Bring new light to an old problem.
That's right.
Juan, thanks as always. Great to hear from you.
Thank you, Bob.
And thanks to you for watching Flashpoints. We'll see you again next time right here.